Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Manna Ministry. We are excited, as we are every time we meet, to delve into a new episode. And before we go ahead and do that, we do want to remind you to please to share, to subscribe, and to follow us either on our Instagram page, where we do post our flyers and our announcements, or on our YouTube channel. You just have to type into the search engine Manna Ministry, and you will find our videos from the past episodes, as well as videos from our previous series regarding relationships. But we are focusing now on our new series, which has been not quite so new. We've been having a couple of episodes already, but this is our new mental health series called Truth Prescriptions. We're wanting to know what is truly the truth when it comes to mental health, because there's so much information that's out there, but it's hard to know what the truth is. And for today's particular episode, the truth is going to be very important, right, Katie?
That's very, very correct. Yes.
Yeah, so I would like to introduce myself. My name is Crisel Olazaran. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and our co-host is.
My name is Dr. Katie Elson, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us. And so we do want to start with a disclaimer. And this disclaimer is just to remind you that the intention of this series is not to provide or substitute any professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment, but rather our intention and our purpose is to provide spiritual guidance of how to utilize the Bible as a practical guide for your mental health well-being. But please always seek advice if there's any particular question you have from a mental health professional, or in regards to any condition you may have when it comes to your mental health.
Yes. And if you are in a crisis or you have an emergency, we have some suggestions here, some help, some resources to call 911 or to call the suicidal hotline, national hotline number, 1-800-273-TALK. Of course, if you're in a different country, to call your local emergency line. And then today on the topic of addictions, we will also be providing a hotline number later on for resources as well. But we want to make sure that you're safe and that you're getting the help that you need.
Yes.
And
So
so as
welcome.
mentioned,
Katie, what's the title of our episode today?
the fiction of addiction.
I love how that rhymes. So clearly, we're going to talk about the importance of truth, because fiction is a lie, right? And we're wanting to know what is the truth when it comes to addictions, because there's a lot of information out there, and some that either we ourselves have chosen to believe, or not, we're not even aware that what we believe is not the truth, that it's an addiction. I mean, a fiction of addiction. So let's actually have an icebreaker question before we begin, and I'll go ahead and let Katie, Dr. Elson, share that.
Yeah, so we always like to start with an icebreaker question just as an opportunity to, it's almost as if we're whetting the appetite for the episode and have our brain start thinking about the topic. And this one's a little bit less of a, we definitely want to hear your response, and more so just again to kind of get those wheels turning of your mind. So we wanted to pose this question of what do you think is a common myth about addiction, right? Myths being things that we've heard very often about addiction, but are not true. And so feel free to message in the chat if anything comes to mind. And I don't know, Crisel, if you want to mention, or if we'll just both of us hold off until we come to the episode itself. But do you want to chime in?
I'll just share one, which we will address later on in the episode. But I think one that I've had as a child growing up, not currently now, but as a child, was that addiction was just related to drugs. That addiction was nothing outside of a drug.
So Crisel, you're saying that's not only about drugs?
Yes, it's not only about drugs.
Okay.
That's a myth.
Yes. Yeah, that's actually our first one, which we'll cover.
Mm-hmm.
Any other ideas, feel free to message. And actually, what we're going to do is, because we have such a full episode of a lot of content, and Crisel and I were debating whether or not to do a part two, and we'll see how time goes. My anticipation is that we'll have to do a part two, just because one, there's a lot of information. Two, Crisel and I are really passionate about this and we want to talk about addictions. And then as well as time does not allow for these rich conversations at times. So there's a comment here that says homeless people are addicts, right? That's a big myth, a type of people that are addicts, definitely. So feel free to send in your responses, but we're going to continue and we'll try to include those responses throughout the presentation as well. But we really want to cover briefly, as we do every episode, our truth prescription from our last episode. Chriselle, do you remember what our last episode was on?
I remember what it was on. I don't remember the truth prescription though. So take a chill pill. What was that?
Someone not doing their homework?
Guilty. I'm helping other people do their homework throughout the week. But yes, our latest episode was take a chill pill, which is a common phrase we can hear people say to us, or that we ourselves may have been guilty of saying to someone else, or thinking of wanting to say to someone else. But our topic last episode was in regards to anxiety. And just a quick reminder, we're focusing on that one triangle, and the different components was thoughts, emotions, and feelings and behaviors. These current episodes are focusing on behaviors, and later on we're going to go into thoughts and emotions as well.
Yes, and so our truth prescription in regards to specifically, we talked about how to manage anxiety, was to reflect on what are your vulnerability factors. Actually, this is from the previous episode. So let me pull up the one from before. Give me a second. Chriselle, do you remember what it was?
I don't remember exactly what it was.
Okay, that's fine. I'll pull it up right now. Okay, here we go. Okay, prevention. Engage in deep breathing. Right? Do you remember what TIP stands for?
Temperature.
Yes, keeping the temperature.
I's, intense exercise.
Yes, very good.
And P is paced breathing coupled with muscle relaxation.
Yes, so here we see prevention, engage in deep breathing and singing daily, and then engage in TIP, which Chriselle just mentioned, when anxious or in distress.
So I did do my homework. I sang and I taught a patient how to deep breathe.
Wonderful, Chriselle. Very good. All right, so as we do every episode, we want to make sure we're encouraging not just information, but application, right? Because if you think about it, if we're just watching these episodes and we're not doing anything, it's like that image we showed previously in a prior episode of people sitting around and saying, what if we do nothing, right? We change nothing and just something magically happens. And that doesn't happen when it comes to mental health, right? We also read the quote that says, human effort combined with divine effort, right? What leads to complete and entire victory? And so we want the victory. Are we doing our part in our effort?
Yes, we have a viewer here who did do their truth prescription and says, I did it and I had a great Sabbath afternoon. Very happy to hear that.
All right, Chriselle, do you want to start us off with a word of prayer before we start our episode today, the fiction of addiction?
Yes, let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear God in heaven, thank you, Lord, once again for the opportunity to be able to be here on this platform, to learn more about you and to share to others, Lord, the truth. There are so many lies out there that we may not even be aware are lies, but we do ask at this moment that you speak to us, reveal to us the truth, Lord, and convict us in ways that we need to change. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So the fiction of addiction. So as the title entails, we are going to dive into lies, fictions regarding addictions, because there are many of them. And as we're diving into them, if any comes to mind that we haven't said, feel free to share that in the chat. We'd love to know your feedback, your comments, or even questions that you may have. I know it's Katie and I going back and forth, but if you'd like to share in and chime in, that would be wonderful. So, Katie, what is, I wouldn't say the number one lie because we're not ranking them, but what is a lie when it comes to addictions?
Yeah, so we wanted to start off with the first kind of group of lies, in which lies we say about addiction. Then we'll cover lies, the lies that the addiction tells us. But first, we want to start with lies we say about addictions. And the first lie is one that Chriselle had previously mentioned in our icebreaker question. Addictions are only drugs, right? When most of us think about addictions, and we think about, when someone just says the word addiction, we immediately think about drugs. We think about marijuana, we think about cocaine, meth, heroin, etc., right? But Chriselle, you mentioned this before, and maybe you want to elaborate. No, that's a lie. That they include other things other than drugs.
Mm-hmm. You want me to share what the other ones are?
Yes,
there are many of them.
With the definition of addiction that can help kind of set the stage for us moving forward.
Yes. And so before we actually share what those addictions are, let's kind of utilize our minds to develop an understanding of what first is an addiction, to then be able to clarify what could be considered an addiction, right? So addiction is the repeated involvement with a substance or activity despite the substantial harm it now causes, because that involvement was and may continue to be pleasurable and or valuable. So when it comes to defining what addiction can be, there are four key components to that. And so we want you to pay attention to those four because it helps clarify and helps us identify what could be considered an addiction. So number one, addiction includes both substances and activities. So it's not just substances. So there, that debunks the lie, right? That it's just drugs. Right? So it can also include activities. Okay. Number two, addiction leads to substantial harm. Now, that could be, what does harm mean? We can dive into that as well. Number three, addiction is repeated involvement. So not just involvement, but repeated involvement, despite that substantial harm that the addiction is causing on your life and on your functioning. And then number four, addiction continues because it was or is pleasurable and or valuable to whatever circumstance you're currently experiencing. So those are the four components, okay? So taking that in mind, Katie, what are other addictions that are not just drugs? Because addictions are not just drugs, that's a lie.
Yeah, so we're going to focus on the first component of that definition, which is addiction includes both substances and activities, which in some ways not in some ways, but they say often behavioral addiction. So there's drug addictions, right? Substances, and then there's behavioral addictions. So if you want to message in the chat, feel free. We love the participation. Or if you're watching this later and still want to comment, you can feel free to comment. What are other addictions? So again, we have the drugs that we often think about, but what are some other behavioral addictions? Chriselle, you want to name a couple?
Yes, a behavioral addiction could be binge watching shows.
Oh, Chriselle, you just really hit the nail on the head for many, many young people, and maybe not so young either, right? That's a very, very common one these days. And I would say kind of to take a step back from that and do a little bit more of a bigger view, a broader view, screen time, technology, right? So that it can include, yes, binge watching. It can include video games. That can include social media, TV.
And I just want to say that someone may be watching this and saying, well, how can that be harmful? Like all of us have televisions for the most part. All of us have telephones. How can screen time be addictive? But if you pay attention to what we said, binge watching, right?
Yes.
There's a point where it starts to cause that substantial harm. And that's where
later. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So we want to clarify that.
Yes. So screen time, right? And that includes a host of different things. Eating, that's another very common one. I just, maybe Chriselle, you hit a couple of our viewers with the binge watching, and people are like, oh, you're already speaking to me. Now I just hit a couple of other ones, right? With eating. Eating is very, very common. Well, not just eating, right? So the same way you said binge watching is binge eating or overeating, right? And overeating is eating more, right? And it could even be a good thing, but eating more than what we need to. And then one common addiction in the category of eating is what, Priscilla?
Of eating?
Yes. Think about when your clients talk about overeating something, the most common one is what?
Anything containing sugar.
Sugar, yes. Processed sugar.
Mm-hmm.
That's very, very common. And then also including work. When we used to say this a lot. I haven't heard it as much in the recent years, but workaholic. Oh, they're workaholic. And I think maybe we haven't heard it in recent years because more and more people, it's more the norm.
It's more
so
acceptable.
Workaholic is like the alcoholic, right? This idea, we recognize that also as an addiction. It can be an addiction. What are other addictions?
Shopping.
Oh, yes.
Some people say, but it's pleasurable. But there are some individuals who struggle significantly with shopping to the point that they are financially in debt. There's divorce because of a result of that addiction to shopping. Yeah. There's isolation from friends and family because you're so consumed in that desire and need. We'll talk about that later. For shopping, we have a viewer here who says gossiping. Yes, that is definitely, that could become an addiction, that you're consumed with just other people's problems, thereby avoiding your own. That could be an addiction as well.
Yes, and going back quickly to shopping, one thing that I had learned as a clinician is I used to ask, about addictions, and I used to commonly, assess for drug addiction. And then you start learning more, and you're like, okay, I got to ask about eating. Yeah. And then most recently, I was like, okay, I got to include everything, because often I'll ask more generally, and they're like, oh no. And then later on, I find out about their shopping addiction. So often I'll list out these things and ask them. And some people they don't know until they're actually asked, like, oh, wow, yeah, you're right. Shopping, another one, gambling, right? Prescription drugs. That one's very, very common these days, right? They talk about the opioid crisis because there's so many people addicted, right? Sex, which includes masturbation, pornography, orgasm. So many can fall under this category, but it's very, very common.
Yes, and then there's one that you may have never considered as a possibility to include in the categories of addiction.
Well, before you get there, somebody messaged us on our Instagram account asking about infatuation. Can infatuation be an addiction? And I asked them to clarify what specific type, and what they're including is love infatuation. So it's not just sex addiction. It can be love relationships, right? Toxic relationships have this addiction towards love and relationships as well.
Exactly. And I remember I've asked a particular, patient of mine, are you addicted to your partner? And the person was like, I've never even thought about that.
Yeah.
It can happen.
We have a prior episode entitled Lovesick. Do you remember that one, Chriselle? On a biblical character who had an addiction to love, Samson, right? So we encourage you to watch that episode if you struggle with love addiction. And I mean, any addiction, really. Samson has some good lessons for us to learn, and we might cover, we will cover, not Samson, but other biblical characters on the topic of addiction, because we can learn a lot about how they dealt with addiction, the to-dos and the not to-dos. Now, Chriselle, you're going to mention another form of addiction that we often don't think about.
Yes, helping others.
What?
I know. When I've said that to others, they're like, what? How can that be? It's good to help other people. That makes you feel good. I said, well, it makes you feel good, right? But what is your motivation to helping others? I know that, yes, it's good. I mean, the Bible talks plenty about, the impact of helping others and how it impacts you as well. But sometimes we utilize helping others to avoid our own problems, because it feels so good to help others, but then we're not helping ourselves.
Yeah. And I do presentations and speaking engagements for different churches, schools, conferences, and I remember I went to the specific school where it's training for ministry, and I remember specifically recognizing that often churches or ministries, they attract individuals who struggle with their mental health, which is a beautiful thing because they find the healing power of God and they want to be able to help others. But sometimes they don't receive the complete healing or complete recovery. And then they use ministry or they use helping others or serving others, as you mentioned, Purcell, as a way to cope or mute their hurts, their wounds, their emotional wounds, and can lead to, I call, ministryaholics, where,
Ministry.
yes, it can be definitely toxic as well.
You know,
Another one that, go ahead.
I would say one that just came to mind is also an addiction to adrenaline. When there, you need that rush, and so you do all these certain activities that push adrenaline into your system because they're like, I think I've heard people say, I'm always chasing that high, that adrenaline high. So they do extreme sports and.
Yeah. One that we didn't mention, which can be categorized under substances, but one that we often don't think about as a drug and is actually one of the top addictions is caffeine. And we have an interesting, we'll get to this. I find it fascinating about kind of the evolution of how the culture views certain substances and what we normalize. One of those. Although we can normalize a substance, it doesn't change the fact that it is a substance and it can lead to an addiction. So caffeine as well. And there's other ones we didn't mention like hoarding and so forth. But the top 10, just to quickly review the top: caffeine, especially coffee, tobacco, nicotine, alcohol, sex, illegal and prescription drugs, gambling, internet and technology, video games, food, and work. So that was the first lie that we say about addictions, is that addictions are only drugs, but no, they are also inclusive of behavioral addictions, so behaviors and activities. Now, Crystal, what's the second lie that we say about addiction?
That addictions are only harmful.
That's interesting.
Yeah, didn't we just say in a definition that it leads to substantial harm? Someone might be like, are they contradicting themselves? But addictions are not only harmful. What we mean by that is, for some reason, we use them, right? So to some extent, they're being helpful for us. Now, is it the most helpful? Meaning that's the only thing that can help us cope? No. But there's a reason that leads us to become addicted to the certain things that we choose, right?
Yeah, and this is really important to think about because when we don't struggle with addictions and we hear that someone does, we immediately shame them. Right? And instead of first understanding, I think this is a good place to start with somebody, is first understanding why they use it. Like there's something in a substance. If addiction were only harmful, all negative, then I don't think they would be as prevalent as they are, right? And so when I work with individuals who struggle with substance use, specifically substances, I just tell them, like, I get it. They're helpful. And they look at me, what?
Because are you promoting it, Katie?
What was that?
Are you promoting it, Dr. Elson?
Yeah, right. And you look at me because often immediately doctors or therapists or whoever, maybe family members, immediately jump to, they're so harmful, why are you doing it, But starting from a place of understanding, they are helpful, right? I mean, they have some utility. Now we're going to talk about how harmful they actually are, right? Weighing the pros and cons. But the main reason or main function that it serves for a lot of people is that it helps them cope. They use it as an external coping mechanism. How does that help them cope specifically, Kusal?
In terms of having a coping? Well, one thing that I've heard, regardless of the particular addiction that someone is engaged in, is that it numbs them or it mutes whatever problem they're going through. I know that if I've worked with alcoholics, and they've mentioned to me that the moment that they consume their alcohol, it's like they don't think about either the emotional pain they're going through, the conflict they're going through in their marriage. It
Lack
just
of
kind of gives
connection.
them a moment of peace.
Mhm. False
Yeah.
peace. Yeah.
Also, that's why I say peace, right? Yeah.
And not just one that I've heard is like, okay, it kills time, right? Because they have lack of meaning or purpose.
Mm,
That it's just to get them through the day, right?
yeah.
If you also think about not just alcohol, but for example, binge watching, it kills time, right?
It
It
also numbs.
it numbs. I don't want to think about the problems, which it does work. You do
Mhm.
not think about your problems for those 3 hours, those 4 hours, or however long. But dot dot dot, we'll talk about what comes next after.
Yeah.
Not only does it mute or numb or kind of kill time, but it's also pleasurable.
Mhm. Let's
What?
be real, right?
It is. So,
Yeah, the
well,
way
in
that
what
it
ways?
impacts the brain.
Yeah, in what ways is it pleasurable?
Well, in terms of, dopamine.
Okay.
I mean, depending on the drug, but yes, overall addictions, when it hypes up the dopamine level,
Mm-hmm.
which
In the
is
reward center.
the reward, right? It makes you feel good. And
Mm-hmm.
so when something feels good, it's like, oh, it's encouraging me to want to continue it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's then leading to an addiction.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, chemically, right, there's an impact. Also, what are other ways in which people say it's pleasurable? So, the benefits of certain drugs.
I've heard that, oh, when I have a particular drug, it makes me more energetic. I can actually clean my house when I'm on this drug. I can actually function at work. I've heard others say, oh, when I drink alcohol, it makes me more sociable. Otherwise, I'd be super insecure and I wouldn't be able to go up and have fun at a party. So I got to drink alcohol to kind of loosen me up.
Mm. Yeah.
Mhm.
And again, this is not us promoting these
No,
drugs, it's to
it's just
recognize,
to understand.
yeah, understand
Mhm.
and recognize there is a component. And I'm not sure if we should introduce it now, Chriselle, but
Mhm.
I think it may be a good kind of place to introduce it. But kind of who's behind this, right? Why is it pleasurable? You want to go into it? You want to reserve it
I
for?
want to reserve it.
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
put a pin in it.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify, to understand something does not mean to justify it.
Yes, good point.
Okay. We're understanding to be more helpful in how to approach someone who may be struggling with this, or even helpful to yourself if you're struggling with addiction, to understand, oh, it's not that I'm an addict. It's that I'm trying to cope with something through this avenue, which is unhealthy. So I need to cope with something. What's something else that's a healthy way to cope with whatever I'm struggling with? So we're not justifying it, but we need to understand it to figure out what could be the solution for it.
And what you're mentioning, Chriselle, is because yes, there may be some pleasure. Yes, there may be some benefit. But now we're going to talk about the other side, right? And so, can we find something that also has those benefits,
Mm-hmm.
but not all of the cons? And so, the next section is we just covered what, the lies we say about addiction. We say, oh, no, addiction is just drugs. No, addictions also are behaviors. We say addictions are only harmful. That's why we don't understand people who struggle with addictions. But no, they can also be helpful, right? And beneficial. Now, what are the lies that the addictions say to us? And these are really important because we just adopt, we just say, yes, we accept these lies, the fictions of addictions. So the first one, number 3 in the lies,
Mm-hmm.
the first lie addiction says to us, bridging off of our last lie, is they're only helpful. So one way we talk about addiction is only harmful. The other extreme is they're only helpful. We only talk about the benefits. Not only do we say that they help us function or they mute, but some people even say, no, they take my problems away,
Mm-hmm.
right? But Chriselle, is is this true? And how are we going to address this more specifically? I think this is actually going to be a large component of
Mhm.
our presentation or episode today.
Yes, the biggest lie is it takes my problems away, because the reality of it is it adds problems to your life. It doesn't take away, it adds problems. And so there are different departments in which problems are added. And what are those, Katie? Physical,
Yes.
emotional, psychological, and we're going to break it down. They're spiritual.
Mhm.
So it adds problems. It doesn't take away your problems.
So essentially, although there may be some benefit
Mhm.
to addictions, right? And that's why people have addictions, is that it kind of ropes them in.
Mhm.
But there are a host of harmful effects, right? When we talked about addiction, substantial harm, and like Crystal just mentioned, in all the different areas of our life. So, physical health, how do certain um, addictions impact us physically? And because there are so many addictions, we are not able to cover all of them. And so, what we're going to try to do, we're going to try our best to highlight a couple just to see, and different drugs in different sections, just to get an overview. So, Crystal, when we talked about physical health, what are some things, some ways in which certain drugs and substances and addictions impact our physical health?
Well, to name a drug that is commonly used today, cannabis, right? I often hear a lot of patients tell me it's helpful, it's helpful, it's helpful, it helps my anxiety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody wants to talk about how it actually harms their physical health. Some even say there's not enough research. There is research. So this is just a couple, or just, yeah, it can lead to lung, throat, mouth, and tongue cancer. And a lot of, yeah, I know a lot of youth that I work with say there's no side effects. It's just, it's helping me through this time in my life.
Yeah. Cocaine, another commonly used substance.
Mhm.
This one's quite scary, right? Some people say, "Oh, it helps me focus."
Gives me
It can
energy.
overstimulate your heart, right? Really cause it to overwork, and also your brain. That it can lead to a seizure, it can lead
Nervous
to a
system.
stroke, it can lead to a heart attack, right? These are serious health concerns. What about caffeine, Crystal? We really wanted to include this one because caffeine is so widely used, right? Abused, and we think, oh no, this isn't a drug. It's just part of my day to day.
Hmm. And what's funny, Katie, is I've heard individuals who are common coffee drinkers, that they will say, "Oh yeah, I need to get that coffee again because I'm starting to have a headache, or I'm starting to feel low. I got to get that coffee again." Like they kind of know what the physical impact is to some extent, but if you don't know what coffee or caffeine, let's specify that because caffeine is not just in coffee; it can be in teas and energy drinks, etc. It decreases blood volume and oxygen, can lead to headaches, can lead to dizziness, rapid abnormal heart rhythm, can lead to dehydration, and
Mhm.
it can ultimately lead to your death. What? Caffeine? Why
Yeah.
isn't it banned?
So, and one thing that was fascinating, I was looking at some research, and it talks about in a study that caffeine decreased the overall global cerebral brain fluid
Mhm.
by 27%, right? So when
Wow.
people talk about headaches, for example, it's constricting the blood vessels, right? It's not allowing for your brain to receive oxygenated blood. Like you can't think clearly. And so people think that they're enhancing their performance, but it's actually reducing. And that's why a lot of people have withdrawal symptoms
Mhm.
because it's a drug. And when you mentioned, Crystal, about death, there are different stories, but one that I remember hearing about in the news was in 2017, a 16-year-old boy in South Carolina dies from a caffeine overdose. So I believe he drank, there's, I think, like a large soft drink of Mountain Dew, I think an energy drink, and like a coffee or something from McDonald's.
Wow.
Just those, and it caused arrhythmia, so of the heart, and he died.
Wow. And this was just caffeine.
Another one commonly that we don't think about is alcohol. Alcohol is so socially acceptable, and alcohol can lead to death. So how specifically can alcohol lead to death?
Well, many different ways. But one thing we do know about alcohol is that it impairs your judgment, right? It impacts the frontal lobe.
Mm-hmm.
And when we have impaired judgment, we can engage in risky behaviors that can then lead to our death, such as car accidents, walking out into an open road. If we're not thinking and realizing that that can cause us death because we have an impaired frontal lobe, we engage in a behavior and then we die.
And that's, I think, the way that we think about alcohol leading to death in most cases. And that's why we're like, oh, no, but I won't make those bad decisions. But what people don't recognize is alcohol is a depressant. And the impact that it has on the brain is, in the back here of our brain, we have our brain stem. And down here in our brains, we have kind of more of the instincts, right? Things that we're not thinking, we're not using our cortex to think. It's just, our posture, our balance, things that are kind of more natural. And one of the key things is our breath, like just telling us to breathe. I don't sit down and have to constantly think, Katie, breathe, Katie, breathe. But what it does, it can turn off the place of your brain that is telling you to breathe.
Yeah.
And so you stop breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol is a depressant, both on your frontal lobe, the ability to think clearly, and then also on your brainstem and other aspects, other parts of your brain. And so we saw a couple of statistics that we want to read. I think these are a little obvious, so we won't go through all of them, but just to show the gravity of the substantial harm. Again, a part of the definition of addiction is a substantial harm.
Yeah. So here's one in 2017. So not too many years ago, 34.2 million Americans committed DUI, which is driving under the influence, 21.4 million under the influence of alcohol, and 12.8 million under the influence of drugs.
Every year, worldwide, alcohol is the cause of 5.3 death, a percentage of deaths, which means 1 in every 20. That's huge, right? And so that's alcohol, but about 130 Americans die every day from an opioid overdose.
On average, 30 Americans die every day in an alcohol-related car accident, and 6 Americans die every day from alcohol poisoning.
Yeah. And this statistic I found very interesting. Since 1990, the overdose deaths, and these are different drugs, have more than tripled. Wow. You can see the rates of, and these are talking a lot about drugs. Now, we're not even talking about addictions. Talk about addictions, Chriselle. Even in the last, so I've been doing therapy for the last 6 years, I believe, 6 years. The rate of addictions for the behavioral addictions have just skyrocketed, like anecdotally, right, with my clients. Like that, we are becoming more and more of an addictive society.
Yeah. And, we've talked about, the physical impact of these substances, but just really briefly, going back to binge watching, right? They're showing a lot of statistics in regards to children who are playing video games, watching a lot of television, that it's leading to obesity. It's leading to poor concentration, that they can't concentrate in school. And so it's really impacting their physical health.
Yes. So another quick kind of fact about how addictions can lead to impact on physical health is I wanted to include this because it's something that we don't talk about and it's something that we don't recognize. So for example, masturbation. And some are like, oh, you're going to go there. I'm going to go there. A lot of times the research is saying, oh, masturbation is so healthy, right? And we'll talk about also briefly the impact more psychologically and socially, but on your physical health, you're like, what? Isn't it healthy? Frequent masturbation can lead to zinc deficiency. So what people don't recognize is there's a lot of different vitamins and minerals in semen, right? And so because you're losing that and with such frequency, you can have low levels of these vitamins, and specifically zinc deficiency can also, because zinc and copper kind of go together, zinc deficiency can lead to a copper toxicity. And so those two together, or even separate, but they often go together, can lead to, and I'm going to read a couple of symptoms, and you'll realize, wow, not only does it impact physical health, but it's going to lead to our second point of how does it impact psychological health? Something I do physically can impact my psychological health. Yeah. Leads to chronic fatigue, low energy, irritability. There's other things like oily skin, acne, so forth, which it's interesting because they say, oh, men, you should do this in order to be more confident in yourself. And that leads to other impacts on your physical health and on how you look and your appearance. That leads to
affect your
confidence. Can lead to depression, anxiety, an overactive mind, right? Racing thoughts. So it's interesting, clinicians, if you're watching this as well, it is important to assess for masturbation because that might be leading to an overactive mind, racing thoughts, or anxiety, depression, that you may try to do different thought records and thought techniques or interventions, but this might be the root of it. Also migraines, certain cravings, right? Especially when you have a copper toxicity, cravings for copper foods, which could be chocolates, can lead to a sugar addiction. You can have frequent colds with, impaired immune system, mood swing. So it's really important to assess for these different addictions and the impact of that they have on our mental health.
That's something you would never think of, right? And it's being promoted now. I know that the most recent thing was in regards to first graders being taught how to masturbate, that it was helpful for them. Yeah. So it's interesting how while our society and culture say one thing, doesn't mean that it's true.
Yes, and what's actually interesting is these are things, and we've already very explicitly stated this, that intention of this series is not just to talk about mental health, but talk about it from a biblical perspective. There are things that the Bible have talked about over and over and over again. A lot of people are like, oh, that's religion. But God cares about our health. There's a recent community, I'm not sure if it started on Reddit, but it's been promoted on there. It's called the NoFap community. And it's coming from a secular perspective. And this community is against masturbation, pornography, and other sexual addictions. And it's basically trying to encourage people not to engage in these things because of the different physical and mental and psychological, social, etc., negative impact.
So that was the physical impact, right? Because we're talking about the lie that addictions are helpful. No, they're harmful. That's what we know, because this is just one example, the impact on our physical health. But there are other impacts. What's the next one that we're going to talk about, Katie?
We're going to talk about psychological health. So we were kind of just mentioning that, right? With masturbation, not only physical health, but also impacts our cognitive and psychological health. What's interesting about addictions, it has like this bidirectional relationship where it can lead to more psychological effects like depression and anxiety, but you could also utilize the addiction to address that, to cope with that. So even for people, for example, with masturbation, they say, oh, it relieves stress, it calms me, it soothes me. So it's a bidirectional, and that's really, and again, we'll talk about this later in regards to who's behind all of this. But that's the strategy. If I present something to be helpful, just a wee bit helpful, but then, there's a substantial harm, it creates a cycle of addiction because I need it, right? I feel like I need it, but I'm utilizing the very same thing that's causing me. It's kind of like, when we talk about addictions with love or relationships. A man will abuse his wife, or a wife might abuse her husband, right? But then comfort them, because then I'm causing you the harm, but then I'm also leading you to be addicted to me, because then I'll also soothe you. That's the same thing that other substances do. I cause the harm. It's like a doctor that would mess up on a surgery so that you have to come back to him over and over and over again, which is so
A
messed up.
cycle of abuse, yeah. And that's why it's so hard for those who are abused to leave their abusers. And those who are outside are like, just leave, just leave. But it's literally like an addiction, like you just described.
It is. Mhm.
Wow.
So another a key I would say example of that's technology. So
Mhm.
technology creates this impact, right, on your psychological health that then leads you to want more and more. So I don't know if you ever learned this, Priscilla, in when you talk about learning and reinforcement,
Mhm.
learn about different schedules of reinforcement. So, for example, if you reward someone consistently, let's say you tell a child, okay, every day at 1 p.m., I'm going to give you a reward, right? You're being consistent.
Mhm.
That child, yes, will learn, but it's not going to be super effective. Do you know why?
Because it's always at 1 o'clock.
Always at 1 o'clock. So they won't do anything until 1 o'clock comes.
Mhm.
But the most effectual reinforcement is what they call one of the most is variable ratio reinforcement. So this is not knowing what to expect and when to expect it, and that's what social media does. So, Crystal, how do you think social media uses a variable ratio reinforcement?
I mean, just think about it. When I have my phone next to me, you just never know when that new notification is going to pop up. Oh,
Mhm.
I just got a comment on my Facebook. Oh, on my Instagram, someone just commented something. You
Or
never know.
they
So it's
said,
that constant, I got to keep this here because who knows what I'm going to get.
exactly. And then I always have to refresh and refresh and refresh because I don't know who's going to post something, or I'm not going to know what it's going to say, right? So you're constantly excited and rewarded to see fresh new posts or fresh new notifications. Ding. We like
Yes.
the sounds, we like those animations.
Katie, I don't know exactly if there's a term for this, but I've heard it in regards to social media and the impact on your psychological health is when you feel like you're missing out.
Oh,
So you have to say that again.
FOMO.
FOMO. So that, see, there is a term for it, right? Do you know what I'm
Fear
talking about?
of missing out.
Fear of missing out. Yes, that you're constantly like, okay, I can't miss out. Like, what's the update? What's the update? What's the update? And you're like wanting that pleasure. You want to feel like you're part of the in group, which is part of your psychological health.
Yes. And that reminds me of there are other terms like nomophobia, right? The fear of going without your phone.
Yes.
There's the textophrenia, the fear that you can't send or receive text of, oh my gosh, do I not have service? Oh my gosh, is my texting not working?
Wow.
There's phantom vibrations. Okay, guilty. I've had this. Have you had this?
Yes.
Right? Oh, I got a notification. You go check, and you're like, oh, it didn't ring, right? Or it didn't vibrate.
Yeah.
So different names, because of the fact, whenever there's a name, that means it's popular enough. There's enough people to coin a term. And so a lot of people are having an addiction to their phone, to social media, to technology. And, it's way, way, way too common. But we're talking also about psychological health. So you mentioned, Chriselle, that it also impacts your attention. How does it impact your attention?
Well, I mean, in terms of, there's so many different types of technology and social media, but you're so focused on it and you're being constantly stimulated. So when you want to go and do another activity that doesn't have as much stimulation or hyping up that dopamine level to the extent that that technology or that social media is, you won't find those activities pleasurable. It'll be hard for you to sit still. It'll be hard for you to be able to just be like, okay, like this is pleasurable. You'll be like, I'm bored. Where's my phone?
Yeah, what's interesting is, so I was looking at some research, and it was saying that our ability to memorize, or our memory centers, have shrunk because we are recording everything. So yes, we've thought about this in regards to, I don't know phone numbers anymore, right? We used to know everybody's phone numbers.
Yes.
But even in regards to are emotional memories. So they did a study where they looked at individuals who had their phones or they didn't. And because of like, and I'm so guilty of this, if, my niece is doing something cute, or if I'm, with friends and I pull out my phone and I record it, I record a story or I record it for myself, that impacts the ability, right, to use your memory centers in order to record that memory for yourself. And so it has a drastic impact on our memory centers.
It's like, Katie, I remember recording her, but I don't remember watching her while because I was recording her. It's like my memory is filtered through what I'm seeing here, not necessarily being there present, right? Wow.
Yeah. And, attention and memory, those are two things that are very, very important for us as human beings. And even the attention centers are shrinking as well because we are not able to maintain our focus and attention. We're working on something, ding, right? Our phone. We're doing something else, ding, my watch. They've done research studies on looking at students and their attention. And even if their phone was off, but it was in the room, they were not able to maintain attention. So one small tip is you can leave your phone in a different room off. You really want to study your focus, right? But our ability to focus and maintain attention is extremely, extremely poor.
Yeah. And in regards, really briefly, to social media and technology, someone may be saying, well, I don't use it to cope with anything. Well, you may not use it to cope with anything, but it could be distracting you from improving your health elsewhere. And so having that dopamine hit, as you could say, having that pleasure taken from there does impact when you go and have experiences elsewhere that may not be as pleasurable. So it is impacting you. And in some way, it can lead to the point that you start utilizing it to cope because everything else around you is no longer pleasurable. So I need that hit. So you pull out that phone.
Exactly. So let's talk about, when we're talking about psychological health, we want to talk a little bit about the impact on the brain. And so I'm going to share my screen here and show a couple of ways in which it impacts our brain. So it's just fascinating.
Someone here says, no wonder Pastor Randy Skeet encourages the audience to use their Bible instead of their phones.
Exactly. So here we see, and we've shown this before, right? What happens in our brain. So it gives some examples here. So Crystal, do you want to explain this to us?
I think you could do
it. So we see here in the first picture on the left, kind of normal brain, right? Whenever we have a pleasurable experience, we might have.
Hold on really quickly. I don't see a brain here. I just see the graph.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you were showing the brain.
No. So yes, just the graph. You see normal baseline, right? We have a pleasurable experience, an orgasm, for example, and then we return to baseline. Now, when we have an addicted brain, you'll notice here, it's above baseline, but we get that first drug high. And what happens to our brain, Crystal, to our dopamine? Does it return to baseline?
Well, I can't see here.
It crashes below
baseline.
Yeah. And here's kind of what happens over time. So it drops way below baseline. And then we might have some tolerance there. You see there in the middle. And they start to drop lower and lower and lower. And so that's how addiction gets us, right? Because it wants us to chase that high, but then it crashes below. And so you're saying, oh, I need that. For example, caffeine, right? You actually feel worse, lower energy, more fatigue, right? After you have caffeine or sugar. And so you're like, oh, I need to go back to even just baseline now. And so I turn to the substance, but you need more and more and more, right? That's tolerance, that's build up, more dependence to have even just to barely function anymore. So this is what kind of happens in our brain. Now I wanted to show this video. It's kind of a quick animation to show kind of the power of addiction. All right. So, what are some things that we notice about this character and in relation to addiction, right? We start off the video with this strange thing, doesn't really know what it is, and then he decides to try it, or she, whatever this is, and what happens?
Oh, it's great for a moment of time.
What was that?
It seems to be great for a moment of time and just a woo.
Right? Flying,
Mhm.
pleasurable, right? And that's what we discussed, right? One of the big lies is that it's only pleasurable. And that's how it starts, right? You have the big high is what that this bird or whatever this little guy is would experience, this great high. But then what did we start noticing?
Oh, he would fall. And then his fall
Was
kept
it
getting harder and harder.
exactly, he doesn't fly as high, it doesn't last as long. He starts falling and falling harder and harder. And
Mhm.
his life, what do we notice, starts getting darker and darker. And we notice, so you mentioned this, that he kind of persists, right?
Mhm.
That he starts running faster and faster. And before he was just strolling along, his life was fine. But then his life becomes about addiction itself. So the psychological health, physical health, we saw that it got a little fatter, right?
Yes.
Impact became slower, right? It has a physical health component. The psychological health, right? He's having these highs and these lows and lows, and that he's becoming dependent on it until his life gets darker and darker and darker. Which, Crystal, I want to talk about this emotional health. How does it have an impact on emotional health? So we talked about,
Many
go ahead.
different ways. Oh, go ahead. I was just saying many different ways. I'm like, where to begin? Yes, there's a component back to the brain, right? And the chemical changes in the brain. For example, here we have the sugar, right? Sugar is a common processed sugar, and clarify that many of us consume in our diets. And it actually, in regards to the brain, it down regulates dopamine receptors to compensate for the repeated jolts of fat and sugar.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that we see in many different addictions. So what happens is, because we're experiencing such high hits of dopamine, right? Basically, our brain receptors become overwhelmed to the point that our brain responds by producing less dopamine or eliminating dopamine receptors. So, an adaptation similar to turning the volume down on a loudspeaker when noise becomes too loud. So, over time, what happens is there becomes a blunting response to the dopamine system to everyday stimuli. So we begin to enjoy life less because that sunset that used to give me that nice dopamine, that conversation that I used to have, I'd rather have a conversation on social media or get likes on social media, get that hit of dopamine. I'd rather have that drug. I'd rather have that. I'd rather watch that movie than have a conversation because I get more dopamine. I'd rather have the processed sugar than the delicious fruit that's healthy for me. So the everyday stimuli becomes meaningless or not as enjoyable.
And in terms of how that can impact your emotional health or the emotional health of those around you. So oftentimes when you see those addicted to drugs or just having a general addiction, they will choose that addiction over their family. And they're like, I don't know why, like I'll go after this drug. And it's like, I'm not trying to choose it. It's just, it's kind of like, that's where they're thinking that drug has the control over them. Right. And family members, even children, sadly, when they say, why did my mom choose to have the drug over me?
Mm-hmm.
Is it that I don't have worth? It's so sad to see the emotional side effects when it comes to addictions.
And you're already touching on our next point, the social health, right? So it really impacts relationships. Social
Mm-hmm.
media leading to disconnect, right? Drug addictions destroying marriages. Clients are either those struggling with addiction or they're the adult of the children of those who had addictions when they were, right? So I don't know if I said that clearly, but basically they're the result of parents having addictions, and years and years down the line, they're struggling with their own emotional health as well. So video games can lead to aggression and can impact also relationships. Sex addiction. There's so much research on how, masturbation, pornography, etc., leads to less pleasure, less sexual intimacy in your relationships, which is very interesting because you look at some skewed research, they're saying, oh no, it improves sexual intimacy because you know how to be gratified. It becomes self-focused versus others focus of giving instead of just to be able to experience the love and connection, the bond, which is stronger. The sexual intimacy is stronger if there's emotional intimacy.
Yes, and so another impact would be on your finances. Oftentimes, addictions can lead you to losing your home, losing your job, losing your car. I mean, just becoming, that's why sometimes it can lead to homelessness because you're just so driven to chase that drug and it becomes your whole reality. That's where you saw that video where everything became darkened because nothing else mattered. It's just that's what I need. That's what I need. And so it can lead to financial issues as well.
Yes. Here's a stat for people. Alcohol and drug addiction costs the U.S. economy over $600 billion every
million.
Billion.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, our last area in which it impacts our lives is our spiritual health. We've talked about this before, and it's going to be something that comes up a lot because our frontal lobe is just so important for our functioning, right? Frontal lobe is responsible for what things for self?
Oh, for judgment, for rational thinking, for decision making,
planning, organization, just these higher
problem solving
functions that we need. And it's also very important. That's where we have our moral judgments, right? We are able to make decisions based, good, bad, right, wrong, and it's where we connect with God the most. There's no surprise to me that this is the area in which gets impacted the most negatively by addiction. If this is the place that we think best, we make our decisions, right, and we connect with God and others, of course, this is the area that gets impacted the most, right? And we can think about TV, the impact of TV on the frontal lobe, music, and so forth. And I think we've mentioned this in prior episodes. And one thing that if you think about just the way that addiction works, because it works so heavily and impacts the reward centers of the brain, right? The limbic system, the middle. So if this is our brain, right, this middle section here, what happens is it starts overworking that area and overrides the frontal lobe. So what happens is over time, what they see is that the frontal lobe and especially the connections, right, and the functions of judgment and motivation begin to shrink over time. Shrink.
It's scary.
I do not want my frontal lobe to shrink. And so, Chriselle, we see that there's a lot of lies, and for the sake of time, we're just going to pause here. We have 4 more lies, right? I had a strong suspicion that we wouldn't be able to cover everything, but we wanted to just quickly address that these lies come from somewhere. This is not just something to do with substances, or this doesn't have to just do with the physical component of substances. What is something that's really important that we want to share with our viewers?
Well, if we're recognizing that there are lies, the question is, who's the originator of these lies? Where do these lies come from? How is it that it's so common among many of us and many of us accept them? Where does it come from? And so when we turn to the Bible, which is the truth, the source of truth, right? And we're wanting to know what is the truth. Within the truth, we know the truth of who's the liar, if that made any sense. And so we can actually find that there in John chapter 8, verse 44. And Katie, if you can read that for us, please.
Yes, it says, you are of your father, the devil, the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and we can see how substances lead to death, right? And does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him, none whatsoever. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. He is the father of all lies. And the reason why we wanted to mention this is because a lot of people are like, oh, it's just an addiction or it's just a substance. But behind the scenes, there's this battle going on between good and evil. And if you're not Christian, if you're not a believer, I think you can still see this happening. You look at society, this battle going on, good and evil, this fight over someone's mind, right? For them to make good decisions or bad decisions. Did you have a comment, Crystal?
Yes, if you just, take it to the basic common sense, what would make someone need to lie? What would be the purpose? It's to hide the truth. The truth of what? Do you get what I'm saying, Katie?
Mm-hmm.
And so if he is a father of all lies, what would be his intention or his purpose in lying to us when it comes to addictions? Is it because the addictions are not allowing us to see the truth, which is only found in Christ?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is victory. I know we're talking and focusing on the fictions of addictions. There's also truths of how to overcome addictions, which I'm sure Katie and I are going to share in our next episode, just so you recognize that this isn't all, there's no hope. There is a lot of hope. The father of lies doesn't want you to see that. Therefore, he's masking your judgment. He's masking your ability to have that connection with God.
Yes. And so we see in the very first lie that we mentioned, the lies we say about addiction, that the Satan, the father of all lies, wants us to believe it's only drugs, because then, I'm okay with all these other behavioral addictions. I'm okay. But you're not okay. Those are also addictions. The second one, addictions are only harmful. He wants us to only believe that they're harmful, because then also we may shame others. We may not understand others. We ourselves may continue to relapse because we are not replacing that with something helpful. That's helpful and not harmful. And then the lies addictions say to us, the first one that we covered, and there's still several more that we'll cover in the future episode, is that they're only helpful. He then makes us focus so much on the benefits that, like that character of that little bird or whatever that little guy is that we want the addiction more and more and more, and we don't realize that it's killing us. Another quick verse that I wanted to read, Crystal, John 10:10.
Yes.
And this is really important because it doesn't only show the enemy is the father of all lies, but he's also, which we read about, or we talked about, the impact on the different areas of our lives. He comes, it says, to do three main things. What are the three main things that he comes to do?
So in John 10:10, it says, the thief, the liar, the father of all lies, comes only to steal and kill and destroy.
And so in application to addiction, I see that he comes to steal, right, our joy, right? We see that, we're overstimulating our dopamine receptors, that we're numbing, right? We're not being able to enjoy life as much as we can, stealing our joy, stealing our relationships, right? Our connectedness. He's killing, right? He's killing us physically, emotionally, and destroy. He came to steal, to kill, and destroy.
Yeah.
And then the verse continues and says, but there's a different prescriber. You can choose either Satan as the father of all lies, the fiction of addiction, or you can learn about the truth. You saw?
And the truth found in Christ, he says, I have come that they may have life, not to take life, but to give life and to have it fully.
To have it more abundantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to talk more in the future episode about how Christ wants to give you that life abundant. Mm-hmm. So what we want to end with, we'll have a prayer afterwards, but we want to end with our prescription as a way to start having us think about these things.
Yes, and I just really briefly just want to mention that if you currently are struggling with any substance or any drug addiction, and you don't know how to reach out for help, there is a national helpline. It's 1-800-662-HELP, which is 4357. And it's a free, confidential, 24/7, 365-day a year treatment, referral, and information service. So if maybe you're not struggling, but you know someone who is, that doesn't know how to search for a referral, for assistance, for guidance, feel free to utilize this resource.
Yes. And so the truth prescription is, we want you to start, right? Because we'll continue this topic next episode, but we want you to start reflecting on the various addictions mentioned, right? And whether or not you have an addiction, right? Think about all the ones that we mentioned, and then reflect on the various lies we've covered thus far. And ask yourself, have I accepted any? Am I believing that, oh, no, it's just drugs, I'm okay? Am I believing that it's only helpful, only harmful, right? Recognizing, oh, wow, this is a lot more harmful in my life than I realized. And we'll talk about in the next episode, well, how do you exactly overcome? But the first step to overcome is awareness. And we also want you to just reflect on, again, where's this coming from? There's this battle and there's this fight between good and evil, between Satan, the father of all lies, and God as the God of truth.
Yes. And if you're struggling, like, how do I even identify because I don't have the drug addictions. I mean, I've never touched alcohol, I've never touched a drug. So how do I even begin to identify what could be an addiction in my life? Well, ask yourself, is there anything that I'm utilizing to cope with my problems? And then reflect on that coping mechanism. Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? Does it draw you away from your loved ones? Does it draw you closer to God or further away from God? Does it take a substantial amount of your time that it's affecting your functioning at work? It's affecting your functioning in school. It's affecting your functioning in relationships. It's affecting your spiritual walk. There are some ways that you can begin to open your eyes to identify possibly if there are any addictions in your life.
Yes. All right, well, let's have a closing word of prayer. All right, if you bow your heads with us as we pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, there's just so much to talk about. And that's because addictions are so prevalent in this world and even in our very own lives. And so, God, we just want to come before you with open hearts, with sincere and genuine hearts, asking that you may reveal to us, Lord, even if there are people that are watching that don't believe in you, we still know that your spirit of truth can help them be more aware. Lord, we pray that you may bring that awareness, not as a way that we feel so horrible, that we feel so discouraged, but that you not only can bring to our awareness, but give us the ability, the courage and the strength and the ability to overcome. Lord, we pray also just for a deeper understanding of how the enemy wants to sell these lies to us, that we may believe these things, to fall deeper and deeper into addiction, or to have our frontal lobes impacted, to get in the way of connecting with you and with others, Lord. We don't want to have these addictions where it hurts us, hurts our families, our friends, our loved ones, God. We don't want to have the enemy steal, kill, and destroy in our lives. We want to have life and life abundant. So, Lord, we pray for that. And we thank you in advance because we know that you are not only able to give us that life abundant, but you are also willing. So we thank you and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Katie, for that prayer. And thank you to all of you for joining us on such an important topic, the fiction of addiction. There's so much to talk about. So we're going to have a part 2. So don't forget to join us in 2 weeks to continue our wonderful discussion and discovery of the truth on the fiction of addictions. And we just want to remind you, don't forget to take your daily dosage of what, Katie?
Truth.
Because why?
You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Yes. And so if you haven't seen our previous episodes, or if you haven't shared them with someone who may be needing to hear about them, feel free, once again, just a reminder, to join us on Instagram, to follow us on Instagram for our latest updates, or to also review previous episodes on YouTube. So thank you for joining us. See you in 2 weeks, everyone. Bye.